Welcome to Reform Thinking. I'm so glad you could join us today for this deep dive into the source material.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It's going to be a really heavy but honestly fascinating discussion today.
It really is because, imagine looking out at a world that is just completely saturated in corruption, right?
Uh,
Like unchecked oppression, systemic suffering, and your very first impulse in the middle of all that is to just sing a triumphant, unyielding song about how perfectly in control God is.
right, which sounds honestly, it sounds almost insensitive to a modern ear.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you hear someone doing that today, the immediate assumption is usually, well, they're naive
Mm.
or they're just willfully blind to the agonizing realities of human existence.
Yeah, it feels like toxic positivity almost.
Right. But that jarring, uncomfortable juxtaposition is exactly where we are planting our feet today. We're stepping out of that realm where ancient texts are treated like, decorative greeting cards or inspirational quotes.
Yeah, pulling out the nice, safe verses.
Exactly. We are walking directly into the gritty, really volatile landscape of Psalm 9.
Because it really forces a confrontation, doesn't it? The material we're examining today, it demands that we reconcile two things that the modern mind desperately wants to keep separate.
And those are.
Well, it's this absolute unflinching assertion of God's sovereign justice on one hand, and then the very real, visceral experience of human devastation on the other.
Right. The text just refuses to let the reader compartmentalize those two things.
It does. Psalm 9, especially the first 20 verses, it weaves this massive global cosmic authority, right, together with the desperate pleas of the oppressed.
And the most fascinating part of this deep dive for me is that we actually can't look at Psalm 9 in isolation.
No, you really can't. Not if you want the full picture.
Right, because as we comb through the textual history and the linguistic connections in the sources, there's this profound mystery that emerges about its relationship with Psalm 10.
Yeah, it's incredible. We're going to see how a song of triumphant praise and a really dark corporate lament over God's apparent absence might actually be a single unified breath.
Which is wild to think about. But for anyone listening who wrestles with that tension, believing in a sovereign God while living in a deeply broken world, the architecture of this text offers a framework that is just entirely different from the shallow comfort we usually get.
It really is. But to grasp that framework, we actually have to start by carrying down a pretty massive modern assumption.
Right, an assumption about how we even approach God in the first place.
Exactly. The very opening line of the text establishes a posture that basically defines everything that follows. The author declares this intent to give thanks with, quote, all my heart.
And that's where we get tripped up immediately.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
We have to strip away centuries of cultural baggage attached to that one word, heart.
Because our modern reflex is to hear heart and immediately think of the emotional center, like a Valentine's Day card.
Right. We think of spontaneous affection.
Yeah, like when someone says, I love you with all my heart, they're describing a feeling that just sort of washes over them, right? Something that happens to them.
Yeah, a passive experience.
Right. And if we apply that lens to Psalm 9, we end up thinking the author's just, having a really good day. Like he's overflowing with positive emotions and decides to sing a song.
Which completely undermines the sheer gravity of what is actually happening in the text.
So what is actually happening?
Well, in ancient Hebrew anthropology, the Hebrew word is leb. It is not the seat of spontaneous emotion or sentimentality.
Not at all.
No, it is the absolute defining center of a person's character, their intellect, and most importantly, their will.
Okay, their will. That's a huge distinction.
It's massive. If you trace the usage of this concept, look at the way God describes raising up a faithful priest in 1 Samuel.
Right, chapter 2, I think.
Yeah. The defining characteristic is that this priest will act according to what is in God's heart and mind. It's about a resolute, unbending alignment of purpose, not a feeling.
So when the author of the psalm says, I will give thanks with all my heart, he is not describing a passive wave of inspiration.
Not even a little bit. He's describing an aggressive act of volition.
He's marshaling every faculty of his intellect.
Yes, his memory, his decision-making process, binding them all together to perform a specific action.
It totally brings to mind the command in Deuteronomy, right? To love God with all your heart, soul, and strength.
Exactly. That isn't a command to conjure up a warm, fuzzy feeling.
Because you can't command a feeling.
Right. It's a command to direct the entirety of your will toward the Creator.
And that distinction is just so vital because It explains the mechanics of faith when you're right in the middle of adversity.
Yeah, because the text emphasizes that this willful praise involves recounting and describing God's past works, the act of remembering.
Which we see constantly in the Psalms.
Constantly. And it's not a passive, nostalgic trip down memory lane. It is a calculated, deliberate anchoring of the mind to objective reality.
Right, so when the circumstances around you are totally chaotic, the believer commands their will to look backward at the concrete historical acts of God.
Exactly. You force your intellect to dwell on what God has objectively done, and that acts as a ballast, stabilizing your present reality.
It's kind of like the difference between a sailboat just getting tossed around by the wind and a ship dropping this massive iron anchor down to the ocean floor.
That's a great analogy. The praise doesn't originate from the circumstances at all. It originates from a sheer act of the will clinging to a historical reality.
But that raises an immediate question for me. What is the nature of the reality the author is anchoring to? Because, I mean, if you are marshaling your entire existence to praise someone, the identity of that someone completely dictates the value of the praise.
Right. The object of the faith matters. And in verse 2, the text uses a highly specific theological title for God.
Elyon.
Yes, elyon, which translates to O Most High. And that title completely resets the power dynamics of the universe for the reader.
Because it's an incredibly old title, right? It goes all the way back to Genesis.
It does. Its usage traces back to the Genesis narratives, specifically intersecting with Melchizedek, the priest of God Most High.
So what does that specific title communicate in this context?
It communicates that God is not merely higher up on some sliding scale of powerful beings. Like, he's not just the supreme deity among a pantheon of lesser gods.
Right, he's not loose ruling over the other Olympians.
Exactly. It establishes a category of one.
It's entirely about ultimate, unchallengeable authority. Because if you look at the broader context of ancient Near Eastern thought, localized gods were tied to specific geographic regions or specific nations.
Yeah, their power was totally limited by borders. If you left their territory, you left their jurisdiction.
But elyon shatters that regional limitation.
Completely. This is the assertion of absolute supremacy over the entire earth, over every nation, over every human ruler.
It means the authority being addressed in this psalm isn't fighting for control. He inherently possesses all of it already.
And that is the bedrock of the entire passage. If you read the subsequent verses, all those intense descriptions of judgment and justice without the lens of elyon, you might misinterpret God's actions.
How so?
You might see it as God making a desperate attempt to restore order to a world that's spinning out of control, like he's playing defense.
Oh, I see. But through the lens of absolute supremacy, every action is an expression of perfect, unquestioned sovereignty.
Precisely. Nothing in the cosmic or terrestrial sphere occurs outside of this ultimate jurisdiction. The justice we are about to see isn't aspirational. It is the inevitable enforcement of reality by the one who architected it.
Wow. That really reframes the intense battlefield imagery that just erupts in the next few verses.
It does. The text doesn't leave God sitting on some distant, passive throne. It describes his active administration of justice, and the language is visceral.
Yeah, the author recounts the deliverance from enemies and paints this scene where the opposing forces are not just, tactically retreating, they're physically stumbling and falling.
There are linguistic parallels here to the curses in Leviticus, actually, where enemies trip over one another in a blind panic just from the psychological weight of Yahweh's presence.
Right, it's a profound description of what happens when the corrupted, finite creature comes into direct conflict with absolute holiness. They are just undone at a fundamental level.
And this introduces a really critical Hebrew term that gets repeated 3 times in rapid succession in this section. Avad.
Meaning to perish.
Yes, and the repetition is highly intentional. It drives home the absolute totality of the judgment. These enemies don't merely lose a geopolitical conflict, they perish entirely.
And the text goes even further than that, which is chilling. It states that the very memory of them perishes.
Yeah.
I just want to pause on that concept of erasing a memory, because the weight of that is staggering, especially back then.
Oh, absolutely. In ancient cultures, legacy was everything.
Right. Legacy is the ultimate human pursuit. We build monuments, we write histories, we establish dynasties. All of it is just to ensure that our names echo in the minds of future generations.
We want to be remembered.
Yeah. So to have your existence so thoroughly dismantled that the memory of you evaporates from the earth, that is the ultimate nullification of human pride.
It is, which forces the modern reader to confront a pretty significant discomfort, I think.
What do you mean?
Well, when we hear about a supreme ruler erasing the very memory of his enemies, our contemporary sensibilities immediately scream tyranny.
Ah,
Because we have been conditioned by human history to associate absolute power with absolute corruption.
right. We project the image of the erratic, thin-skinned dictator onto the divine throne, the guy who violently purges his political rivals just out of paranoia or malice.
Exactly. And it's a natural projection because human judges and human kings are inherently flawed.
Yeah, when we think of a judge with sweeping authority today, we immediately worry about bias or systemic corruption.
Yeah.
Or even just, the weary apathy of a civil servant mechanically applying a dense legal code without any context.
Right. We fear power because we know power in human hands is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah. So how does the text defend the absolute power of elyon against that charge of tyranny? Because it clearly does.
It does. It defends it by introducing a very specific vocabulary of divine justice, a vocabulary that inextricably links God's infinite power to his flawless character.
Okay, let's unpack that.
In verses 7 through 10, the author presents Yahweh as a king administering justice directly from his throne.
And the throne itself is a symbol of uncontested authority.
Right. But the nature of that authority is defined by a cluster of highly specific Hebrew terms. The foundational action is shaphat, which is the verb for judgment.
And the sources note that shaphat appears an astonishing 6 times in this single passage.
6 times. The repetition means we cannot look away from the fact that God is an active intervening judge.
He's not a clockmaker who stepped away.
Exactly. But the qualitative nature of that judgment is defined by the next term the text employs.
Yeah.
Tsedeq, righteousness.
Which is a word we throw around a lot in religious contexts as just a vague synonym for being good.
Right. But in the context of a divine judge, it means something much more precise. It means a perfect, unwavering alignment with an absolute moral standard.
So it means the judge has no internal corruption.
0. No shadow of compromise, no hidden agendas.
And that internal perfection is then translated into external action through a third crucial concept, right?
Yes. Mesharim. And this is perhaps the most illuminating term in the whole sequence.
What does it mean?
It denotes equity, integrity, or even a literal levelness or straightness.
Okay.
When you see mesharim used alongside righteousness and justice in the broader wisdom literature, it paints a picture of a scale that is flawlessly calibrated.
Oh, I like that. Flawlessly calibrated. It's almost like the fundamental laws of physics.
How do you mean?
Well, if you step off a 10-story building, gravity doesn't pull you down because it is angry with you or because it is a tyrant. It pulls you down because it is an absolute immutable law of reality.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
The concept of mesharim suggests that God's justice operates with that same perfect, unyielding consistency. It is not an arbitrary reaction to an offense.
Right. It is the inherent mechanism of a morally perfect universe, correcting an anomaly.
Which completely disarms the accusation of tyranny.
Totally. A tyrant's rulings are arbitrary. They're driven by self-preservation or just shifting moods. The judgments of elyon are the precise, equitable application of perfect righteousness.
So the perishing of the enemies, that terrifying nullification of their very memory, it's severe precisely because the justice is perfect.
Yes, it is the proportionate, inevitable consequence of finite evil setting itself against infinite holiness.
Because the judge possesses perfect mesharim, he is entirely fundamentally trustworthy.
And for you, the listener, the implications of that trustworthiness are deeply, deeply personal.
Oh, for sure. Because if you are experiencing oppression, if you are the victim of profound injustice in a broken world, a passive, non-judgmental deity is completely useless to you.
You don't need a cosmic observer.
No. You require a judge who possesses the ultimate authority to dismantle the oppressor and the flawless integrity to do so perfectly.
Which brings us down to the micro-level reality of this theology. We understand how elyon governs the nations on a macro level, but how does this perfect justice interact with the individual who is currently being crushed?
Right. What does it look like on the ground?
The text provides this breathtaking metaphor for that interaction in verse 9. It states that Yahweh is a stronghold for the oppressed.
The stronghold.
Yeah, but the linguistic reality behind the English translation carries so much more weight. The Hebrew word is misgav.
Misgav.
And this does not describe a fleeting sense of internal peace or some sudden shift to positive thinking. A misgav is a literal geographical reality. It's a high wall, a rocky fortress built into an inaccessible cliff face.
The imagery is just so stark. Imagine being hunted by a vastly superior force.
Mhm.
You're exposed in an open valley, completely vulnerable.
Right.
And then you find this narrow path ascending a sheer rock face, leading into a fortress with 50-foot stone walls. When you stand inside that misgav, the enemy army doesn't just disappear. The violent reality of the world hasn't vanished. The storm is still raging right outside.
Right, but their weapons cannot reach you.
Exactly. Your physical circumstances might still be fraught with danger, but your actual existential safety is secured by the immovable nature of the rock.
And applying misgav to Yahweh means that the believer's refuge is as immutable as God's own character. It is an objective shutter.
It goes back to the will, doesn't it?
It does. When the oppressed person aligns their will to praise God, they are psychologically and spiritually retreating into the high fortress of his sovereign justice.
They are actively choosing to view their vulnerability from the vantage point of his absolute authority.
Yes. But the dynamic of the fortress naturally begs a question about the fate of those who are laying siege to it.
Right. If God is the ultimate refuge for the oppressed, what is the mechanism of justice for the wicked?
The text outlines their fate in verses 15 through 17, and it reveals this profound, almost poetic irony.
The author states that the nations sink into the pit they themselves have made. Their foot is caught in the very net they hid.
The imagery of the net, the resheth in Hebrew, is deeply significant here. This is a hunter's trap. It's a mechanism carefully concealed over a pit or across a path, designed to suddenly and violently ensnare the unsuspecting prey.
Right, so the text suggests that the wicked invest meticulous effort, intellect, and resources into devising methods of oppression and destruction.
They weave these complex webs of deceit and violence.
But instead of God simply striking them down with lightning from the sky, the text describes the wicked becoming ensnared in their own traps.
Yeah.
Which, honestly, there is a temptation to read this as a sort of cosmic karma. You know, the idea that what goes around comes around through some impersonal law of the universe.
Or we might diminish it by comparing it to a trivial comedic trope.
Right, like a cartoon villain setting a trap and accidentally stepping onto his own rake through sheer incompetence.
Exactly. But the theology here is vastly deeper and far more intentional than simple irony or bad luck.
It is the active sovereign judgment of the supreme ruler.
Yes. The universe is constructed by elyon with such perfect moral integrity that evil is inherently self-destructive.
So, whether God actively turns their machinations against them, or whether he simply removes his restraining grace and allows the natural trajectory of their corruption to run its course, the outcome is framed as divine judgment.
Right. Sin, by its very nature, is a rebellion against the architecture of reality. Therefore, it inevitably collapses in on itself. The wicked are consumed by the gravitational pull of their own corruption.
And the final destination of that collapse is Sheol,
The grave. The ultimate void.
the absolute finality of their self-destruction. But what I find really fascinating is that the text doesn't merely label these people as bad in some generic sense.
No, it gives a diagnosis.
Right, a razor-sharp diagnostic of their core condition. Verse 17 identifies the wicked as the nations who forget God.
And we really need to unpack this because the modern concept of forgetting is entirely inadequate for what the Hebrew text is communicating here.
Oh, absolutely. When a modern person says they forgot something, they are usually apologizing for a cognitive lapse.
Right, you forgot a meeting, you forgot someone's name.
It's an unintentional error, a failure of the memory banks. But if we read that definition into the text, divine judgment seems outrageously disproportionate.
It really would. Sending someone to Sheol because they accidentally let a theological concept slip their mind makes God look exactly like the tyrant we earlier proved he is not.
Exactly. Because the Hebrew concept of forgetting in this context is the exact inverse of how the passage opened.
Oh, that's a great connection.
Right. If praising God with all my heart is a supreme act of the will, a deliberate anchoring of the mind to reality.
Then forgetting God is an equally deliberate act of the will.
Yes, it is a calculated, intentional severing from reality. When you trace this phrase through the prophetic literature and the historical narratives, forgetting God is synonymous with active, defiant rebellion.
It is cosmic treason.
Cosmic treason, that's exactly it.
The creature looks at the Creator, looks at the undeniable reality of elyon, the perfect equity of his mesharim, the historical record of his power, and willfully chooses to erase him from their consciousness.
They construct a localized, artificial reality where they are the supreme authority. where the laws of divine justice somehow do not apply to them.
So the psalmist is describing a deeply entrenched, systemic refusal to acknowledge the God who actually is.
It's willful amnesia.
Willful amnesia, yes.
The wicked dig pits and hide nets for the innocent because they have fundamentally convinced themselves that there is no judge sitting on the throne. They believe they operate in a moral vacuum.
And therefore, the judgment of God is not an arbitrary punishment for a memory lapse. It is the perfectly just response to a creature attempting to violently overthrow the reality of the Creator.
God simply allows the full weight of their willful, defiant autonomy to crush them.
So if we step back, we have now built a massive, logically airtight theological structure here in Psalm 9.
We really have. We've established the willful posture of praise, the absolute supremacy of elyon, the flawless equity of his justice.
The impenetrable safety of his fortress.
Right, and the perfectly calibrated self-destruction of the wicked. It is this triumphant, comprehensive view of reality where God is victorious and justice is inevitable.
Which is exactly what makes the sudden fracture in the text so profoundly jarring.
Yes. Right in the middle of this soaring, impenetrable theology of victory, the text just shatters.
It's a complete whiplash.
The psalmist, the very one who just declared that the wicked always fall into their own traps, suddenly cries out in verse 13. He says, "Be gracious to me, O Lord, see my affliction from those who hate me."
And then in verse 18 he states, "For the needy shall not always be forgotten," which undeniably acknowledges that right now, in the present agonizing moment, they are being forgotten.
Right. It forces a crisis of reading. How can the author celebrate the total annihilation of the oppressor in one breath, and then basically beg for survival against the oppressor in the next?
This internal tension within Psalm 9 serves as the gateway to the most significant literary and theological insight of this entire study.
The Psalm 10 connection.
Exactly, the deep organic connection between Psalm 9 and Psalm 10. Because there is incredibly strong textual and historical evidence that these two songs were originally composed as a single, unified text.
And honestly, on the surface, grouping them together seems absurd because their tones are entirely antagonistic.
They feel like complete opposites.
Yeah, we just spent all this time outlining Psalm 9 as a masterpiece of triumphant individual praise. But Psalm 10 is categorized as a corporate lament.
It is the raw, unfiltered cry of a community that feels utterly abandoned by God.
It opens with an accusation. "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?"
And then the author spends verses detailing how the wicked are prospering, boasting, and utterly destroying the vulnerable without consequence.
So if you're looking at this strictly from an editorial perspective, you have to ask, why would anyone attach a dark, agonizing lament to a triumphant song of sovereign victory?
Right, it seems to ruin the theology we just carefully constructed.
It feels like throwing a bucket of cold water on a fire.
But biblical theology does not exist in a sterile academic vacuum. It operates in the brutal, messy reality of human existence.
So the connection between these two psalms is not a contradiction.
No. It is a profound demonstration of how faith actually functions in a fallen world.
Let's break down the mechanics of this connection then. Because the structural cracks we noticed in Psalm 9, the sudden plea for grace, the acknowledgement of the afflicted, they aren't mistakes.
No, they are structural load-bearing pillars that support the transition into Psalm 10. The author is deliberately bringing the cosmic theology of Psalm 9 down into the dirt of Psalm 10.
Oh, I love that phrasing. Down into the dirt.
Exactly. The praise of Yahweh's historical righteous judgments in Psalm 9 is the mandatory prerequisite for the lament in Psalm 10.
Okay, walk me through that. Why is it mandatory?
Well, imagine you are the oppressed community in Psalm 10. You are surrounded by thriving, arrogant evil, and God appears completely silent. Your natural instinct is despair.
Right, you just give up.
Yes. The only way you possess the theological courage to cry out and demand justice is if you have already anchored your will to the reality of Psalm 9.
Oh, wow. Because you cannot lament to a God you do not believe has the power to act.
Exactly. If God is not elyon, if he's not the absolute sovereign with perfect mesharim, then screaming into the void is pointless.
So the lament of Psalm 10 is actually an act of radical faith.
It is, because it holds God to the standard of his own character revealed in Psalm 9.
You intentionally build the towering fortress of Psalm 9 around your mind so that you have a secure theological space to safely scream the agony of Psalm 10.
That's beautifully put. The theology of sovereign justice does not invalidate the pain of the present moment. It validates the petition.
Because you know with absolute certainty that he is the righteous judge who causes the wicked to perish, you actually have the grounds to look at your current affliction and say, This is not right. Arise, O Lord, do not let man prevail.
The juxtaposition proves that acknowledging God's absolute sovereignty and acknowledging your own excruciating pain are not mutually exclusive.
In the biblical framework, they require one another.
And you see this profound unity in how the texts conclude.
Right, because Psalm 10 doesn't just end in despair.
No, after dragging the reader through the depths of human suffering and divine silence, it ends by circling perfectly back to the theology of Psalm 9.
It declares that the Lord is king forever and ever, that the nations perish from his land, and it ends with a final, confident petition for justice for the fatherless and the oppressed.
The two psalms form an unbroken, continuous loop of reality. They map the full topography of the believer's experience.
You start on the peak of sovereign praise, you descend into the valley of the shadow of present suffering, but because you know the architecture of the universe belongs to Elyon, the valley eventually leads back to the throne.
We have covered a massive amount of theological territory today.
We really have. We started by discarding the sanitized greeting card version of the text. We examined the profound act of the will required to praise God with all your heart.
We stood before the absolute supremacy of Elyon, exploring how his perfect integrity, his mesharim, guarantees that his justice is never tyrannical, but flawlessly equitable.
And we looked at the mechanics of the misgav, the high fortress, and the terrifying reality of the wicked who commit cosmic treason by willfully forgetting God.
Only to be crushed by their own autonomy.
Exactly. And finally, we witnessed the collision of absolute sovereignty and human agony in the seamless transition from praise to lament.
It is a framework that refuses to offer cheap answers. It demands that we look directly at the horror of the world while simultaneously gripping the absolute authority of the Creator.
And that tension brings us to a final thought for you to carry forward. We all experience moments where the theology we hold in our heads seems violently contradicted by the circumstances in front of our eyes.
When the wicked prosper and the innocent suffer.
Right. And the temptation in those moments is either to abandon our belief in God's sovereignty or to artificially suppress our pain and pretend everything is fine.
Which neither of those is the biblical answer.
No. If Psalms 9 and 10 are a single breath, it means that true, robust faith is found in holding both realities at once. It means that declaring God as the absolute perfect judge while simultaneously crying out in the darkness of your current unresolved affliction is not a failure of faith.
It is the ultimate, most profound expression of trust.
So how does viewing your praise and your lament as two inseparable sides of the exact same coin change how you approach your darkest trials? Think about that this week. Thank you for diving into the depths with us. Keep wrestling with the text, and we will meet you back here next time.